Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at a sword brought home by a veteran of a bloody war, a diary kept by a World War II prisoner of war, and hear the story of a man's incredible survival at sea. A proud son shares with Kevin the story of his father's harrowing survival at sea during World War II.
My father was the kind of man that stood up for what was right. He didn't take anything from anybody. He asked a lot of us, and I never liked disappointing him.
Jennifer looks at a diary kept by merchant mariner Walter Shaw during his time as a German prisoner of war.
The journal to me is a beautiful representation of art and literature. He's drawing and he's also writing and incorporating this very tumultuous and confusing time for him.
Kevin looks at a short sword from the Cambodian-Vietnamese War.
They hung that big medal around my neck for getting 15 children out of a minefield. And when she was doing it, I said, "Ma'am, don't use the word hero." My name is Jerry White, and I brought in the short sword. It was given to me by a gentleman that we just called the General.
On December 21, 1978, after years of violent offences, Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow the communist, genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. The Vietnamese army's motivations were complex, partly driven by its duty to end the humanitarian crisis, national interests in its disputed territories, and the need to extinguish hostilities at its borders. The initial battle ended with the Cambodian administration being transferred to Cambodian dissidents known as the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which started multinational clashes over Cambodian representation in the UN. In the end, the Khmer Rouge maintained its seat, further isolating the PRK from international support. On October 23, 1991, the United Nations brokered the comprehensive Cambodian peace agreement to initiate a democratized, humane, and free Cambodia, putting bloodshed and civil war to rest.
Welcome Jerry White, retired Canadian Royal Canadian Naval officer and RCMP officer, to the program. Jerry, I was wondering if you could tell us what you brought in today.
Sure, Kevin, thanks for having me. Somewhere along the way, I managed to get involved in some United Nations work and NATO deployments, and on one of my UN deployments to Cambodia, to the killing fields, a long time ago, we were unarmed. Everybody else was armed, which is a little unnerving. But it was given to me by a chap that we simply referred to as the General. We don't know if he was KPNLF or Khmer Rouge or even Khmer for that matter, but I believe he was. And he gave me this. I think he gave it to me as a token of respect.
Certainly.
It's very unique in that it is it's just forged out of a piece of steel. It is engraved, and it has the markings on it of Angkor Wat, which is their national treasure in northern Cambodia. Somebody sat down and engraved it, and they made it probably to impress the General. If closer examination, you'll notice that everything is hand-tooled, hand-machined, and all of these little, it looks like scrimshot, looks like decoration, is actually rivets that go right through the handle. And of course, everything is made out of rosewood and mahogany.
The Khmer Rouge, again, you well know this, rises up in 1968. They begin a civil war with the Cambodian government. They have a sort of non-aggression pact, I guess you could almost say, with the North Vietnamese, in that they're both fighting Americans, so they're not going to fight each other at that point. Again, this is the same time period that the Pathet Lao rises up in Laos as well.
Exactly, yes,
yeah. And then with that, Pol Pot's idea is, it's right up there with Adolf Hitler's, is they want to return Kampuchea. They want to return it back to the glory of the Khmer Empire.
To an agrarian society.
this sort of insanity of Pol Pot and this desire to create like this, fantasy world that he's going to bring back a medieval Khmer empire and this supposedly idyllic way of life. And you're quite willing to kill half the population, your countrymen, to do it.
But my interpreter, Cao Van Son, had been a patrol boat commander in the Cambodian Navy, and he stole a patrol boat, a Russian Stenka-class patrol boat, and he filled it full of just over 600 people, and he sneaked out in the middle of the night and headed for Myanmar and saved 600 lives. I was going to say we didn't play by the rule book, but there was no rule book, so it was pretty easy to not play it. But we would gain access, break into such a harsh term. We would gain access to the UN supply depot, and we would get Quilata lotion, which is used to wash your hair and get rid of lice. We had a German field nurse, and Manfred would get tetracycline. And the two Philippine chiefs, Peña and Mendoza, would steal half a dozen cases of corned beef hash. And as we were going up the river, you'd see these little tiny paths about 6 inches wide where the ladies and the children came down to get water. So we would nose the patrol boat into the path, and the ladies would come down, and they'd size us up really quickly. So we would walk into the village, and children would come out. And one of us would scrub their hair with Quilata lotion. Manfred would give them 5 international units of tetracycline because, regrettably, many of them were born with venereal disease.
Yeah.
They had no control, and they had never known what it was like to go piddle without screaming. So Manfred would give them 5 IUs of tetracycline, or whatever it is they do, and then Mendoza would rinse the Quilata lotion out, and Peña would give them a can of corned beef hash. We could do a village of 140 kids in about an hour.
Well, Jerry, I can't thank you enough for coming in and sharing the story and the experience that the sword represents to you and your comrades that served on the mission.
You're very welcome. One of the greatest compliments, I suppose, my boss at the time, General Dallaire, and I were giving a presentation to Madame Louise Frechette, who was the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. And she said, "What do you think makes Canada better at this?" I said, "We're not better at anything." I said, "But when we're on patrol and we see 100 children down in a ditch cowering in fear, some of them are bleeding, some of them are dying, none of them think they're going to see the end of the day. The other countries call their command headquarters or their national headquarters and request instructions." She said, "The Canadians just jump down in the ditch."
Yeah. That's a great way to put it.
We just jump in the ditch.
Jump in the ditch, yeah.
Fortunately, we could gain a lot of ground just because we were Canadians. Just because we were Canadians. We had to distinguish ourselves from other Caucasian nations, and once they realized that Canadians, these guys show up with cans of corned beef hash and Quilata lotion to get rid of the lice and tetracycline to get rid of the poor children that are born with, but we also showed up with toys,
Coming up on Militaria.
An oil tanker would be an extremely highly valued prize because without oil, you couldn't run the tanks, the trucks, the ships.
My name is Lisa McNiven, and I've brought in a collection of letters and a diary from merchant mariner Walter Shaw. The journal to me is a beautiful representation of art and literature. He's drawing and he's also writing and incorporating this very tumultuous and confusing time for him. And he's very honest in his journal, and it's beautifully written. So I was so inspired when I read it.
Of the over 1 million Canadians and Newfoundlanders who served in World War II, nearly 9,000 became prisoners of war. Troops were equally vulnerable to capture, whether they served on land, in the air, or at sea, and could fall into enemy hands alone or sometimes by the thousands. As late as the 1700s, this would have led to torture and possible death. But with the progression towards modern warfare and implementation of the Third Geneva Convention, captors adopted a new standard to respect the humanity of enemies in their charge. Policing the agreement was almost impossible, and the abuses committed between 1939 and 1945 were traumatizing and deadly. Canada is forever indebted to its POWs, whose sacrifices often extended far beyond the end of war.
Hi, Lisa. Welcome back to Militaria. What have you brought us today?
I have brought a fascinating journal from a Mr. Walter Raymond Shaw. Walter Raymond Shaw was an individual from Dartmouth, and he joined the Merchant Marine in 1940. It was more or less a family tradition. I have records of 3 brothers and a father that were also serving during the war in the Merchant Marine. So 1940 he joins, and leaving from Halifax, the first ship that he sails on, unfortunately, is sunk off the coast of Ireland. He comes back to Halifax. He survives. And in 1941, he leaves on another ship called the Candlelight, and it was an oil tanker, a Canadian oil tanker, but the ship was actually built in Germany.
During the Battle of the Atlantic, an oil tanker would be an extremely highly valued prize, because without oil, you couldn't run the tanks, the trucks, the ships, and the fuel to fuel the war. So without that crude oil coming from North America, it would have really crippled the Allies.
Mr. Shaw's ship is captured by a German ship called the Steerlight in 1941, and it is commandeered by the Germans. They are captured, and they do a march from France to a German, originally a prisoner of war camp, called Millag Nord. Originally, the camp was a concentration camp, but it had been turned into a military and a prisoner of war camp by 1941. While Mr. Shaw is doing the march from France to Millag Nord, he manages to conceal a small typewriter. And this small typewriter will be an interesting factor in his confinement, because while he's confined in Millag Nord, he is sending typewritten notes to about 126 Merchant Marines are also in this camp. And the notes are from pieces of scrap paper that are retrieved from offices of the German captors and commanders by his fellow compatriots. It's a daily journal, a log that he's keeping, but he's also sharing it with the other members of his barrack, his unit. So inside there are daily excerpts, everything from school courses that they were taking to the condition of the barrack hospital, but they're also illustrating it with beautiful watercolors and pen and ink drawings. And there are at least 4 other contributors to Mr. Shaw's journal. Mr. Shaw tended to do watercolors, but there are other gentlemen in there that were doing pen and ink. And it's a beautifully illustrated history of his time and the conflict that he was going through at the time. He was there in what they had called a work camp. A work camp was designed to keep the prisoners engaged, but it was also designed to entertain his captors and the German soldiers that were at the camp. There were courses that were distributed. I think Mr. Shaw had an economic course that he had taken. I have nothing but respect and admiration for a man that was able to endure such hardship but be so eloquent at the same time.
In Shaw's journal, there's a lot of artwork, and I believe that artwork was very therapeutic for Shaw. Art allows us to express a lot of feelings that we're not able to perhaps communicate or even to experience ourselves. Sometimes art is just an expression that comes from within.
I think there needs to be an emphasis of mariners on the water during World War II, and the Merchant Marine and Merchant Mariners deserve more research and more accolades. I would like to have a chance to tell their story.
Lisa, why do you think Shaw thought it was important to donate this to the Naval Museum?
I think Mr. Shaw would have wanted this to be accessible. It's a journal of merchant mariners during the time of war, and it's a very personal snapshot of what him and his fellow companions were going through. I think he wanted people to understand the sacrifice that merchant mariners also endured during World War II. There were also excerpts in the journal where he is thanking the Red Cross. He makes several anecdotes in his journal of, we wouldn't be here without the care of the Red Cross and the diligence, and he's very grateful knowing that there is someone on the other side taking care of them and the men around him.
Lisa, thank you so much for coming today and bringing this beautiful journal and the history that comes with it. So what is currently happening with Shaw's journal at the museum?
The journal is on display at the Naval Museum of Halifax on our second floor in the Battle of the Atlantic Room exhibit room. Along with his medals, there are also copies of his artwork that are on display with the journal. And it's a beautiful representation of art during wartime also. Currently, we have a student that is scanning the journal, and eventually it will become part of our online collection, and it'll be able to be viewed online and more accessible to the rest of the population.
So what a wonderful piece of a civilian piece of history. So at our museum, we talk about our enlisted service members. And so Shaw is a wonderful example of someone who served during a time of war, but was still civilian and still did a lot of the same work that our sailors did during the wartime. So I think it's a really unique piece of our history.
Coming up on Militaria.
They were on deck. He heard the captain say to him, "Jim, get to the deck." He said, "We think the ship hit something." My name's Robert Bonner, and I brought in several items pertaining to my father's voyage on the Cornwallis. I think you have, or I should say, I know you have a telegraph that was sent to his mother saying that he was rescued and he was okay. And there's another newspaper clipping from, I believe, the Chronicle Herald at that time, which states that Nova Scotia man survived or whatever. And there's other articles there, a little bit of an article on Captain Robson, who was the captain of the CNS Cornwallis.
On December 3, 1944, while sailing off the coast of Maine en route from Barbados to St. John, New Brunswick, the SS Cornwallis was attacked by U-boat 1230. The merchant mariners aboard the Canadian steamship understood their exposure, not only because supply vessels were the targets during the Battle of the Atlantic, but because the Cornwallis had once already encountered enemy subs. Torpedo nets and shallow waters thwarted the Germans' first attempt at capture, but 2 years later, when the Cornwallis took a devastating blow to its forward section, its fate was sealed. 48 sailors had under 10 minutes to abandon the sinking ship. Still, a clear and quick-thinking radio operator transmitted a distress signal, enabling a rescue from which 5 lucky men survived.
I'd like to welcome Rob Bonner to Militaria. Thanks for coming in and to share some of your family's history. I was wondering if you could tell us as we get going what you've brought in.
What we have here is a newspaper article from December 9th, 1944, stating that a Florence seaman has survived torpedoing, basically, and a telegram to my grandmother telling her that my dad was okay after the torpedoing.
What was your father's name? And
his name was James Vincent Bonner. He was a seaman aboard the Cornwallis, the CNS Cornwallis.
And this was, I think, I heard you say this was one of his first voyages on a ship.
It was his very first voyage. He was a coal miner prior to that, and he couldn't get onto a ship because coal miners are very valuable at the time. So he went and he found a company that would take him on Canadian national steamships.
Yep.
And this was his very first voyage.
Your dad's vessel was the Cornwallis, had been torpedoed once before in 1942.
That's correct.
I was wondering now, can you shed any more light on your father's experience after the torpedo and things that followed, abandoning ship and whatnot?
He had said that when the ship heeled over to one side, they were on deck. He heard the captain say to him, he was in his bunk, and the captain said, "Jim, get to the deck." He said, "We think the ship hit something." So he went up, and by the time he got up there, he only had his dungarees on and couldn't get the lifeboat off because it went over, and the davits went right down inside the life jacket, so they had to let go of the painter. And he had to hit the lead on the painter, and the painter went in the water. So somebody said, you gotta swim. So he jumped in, and he was in the water. He didn't realize how long he was in the water. And he could hear one of the other crewmen saying, "Over here, Jim, over here." So he pulled him out, and he pulled out 4 other guys.
It takes an extraordinary amount of courage to go to sea at any time. Being out on the North Atlantic or on the Pacific, it's a dangerous thing. The waters between here and Newfoundland to England, they would have felt fairly safe because they're heading to St. John, and they'd only likely be like a day and a half's travel from where they were eventually torpedoed, right? And like he said, his father said they did feel a bit better because they were only 10 miles off the coast of Maine. You could probably see the coast of Maine if you had a set of glasses if you were on deck that day. Now, when you're saying when the ship was torpedoed, it went down so quickly, and she kind of went over on her side.
She heeled out.
Yeah, and then she kind of slid under. So they watched her go under.
Oh, yeah.
Where they were, yeah. And were they ever able to recover any of the other fellas off the ship?
When they picked Dad up, I thought he said that the Notre Dame had already picked up 9 others.
Okay. But everybody else is still on board the Cornwallis under the waters of the Gulf of Maine, yeah. Did your father, did he live to see the recognition that they did receive eventually?
He did. He passed away in 2003, but it was quite a fight to get the recognition.
It was. Yeah.
But government, they came through in the end, and I figure he got his due.
Yeah, they got their time, their recognition they deserved.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. The Merchant Navy, again, it would take, decades after the Second World War for them to finally get the recognition that they did deserve. But there are more merchant seamen will lose their lives at sea than there are members of the Royal Canadian Navy. Now, Rob, I was wondering if you'd be willing to share us a bit of information, a bit of the story of your father's life after the war, what he was like growing up with someone who had been through these things, and, former coal miner, sailor, an interesting individual.
He went back to sea after he was torpedoed, and he was on several ships. He became a rigger at the dockyard, and he worked there for a little while, and then he was thinking about going into the police department, but I think it was in around 52, he decided to become a longshoreman. And he worked on longshore until he was 65, and he retired. He moved to the valley, and it was a very, very peaceful place where he could garden. And eventually he passed away there. But he was growing up. He was a big influence on everything myself and my brothers did.
Sure.
He was good to us.
Good stuff. Great. Yeah. What other plans do you have to kind of continue this, like with these artifacts and other endeavors you've kind of undertaken in the past while to ensure that legacy?
I've been talking to my brother. He's got my dad's medals, and with all of our other gear, I've got much more that I couldn't put my hands on today. I'd like to present it to the Maritime Museum at the Atlantic.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank you one last time again for bringing this in, and it's really good of you again. It shows us every man his own historian, every woman as well. Well, thanks again so much for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. My father was the kind of man that stood up for what was right. He didn't take anything from anybody. He asked a lot of us, and I never liked disappointing him.